Have a look at this photo taken in 1956. Hopefully you can figure out what's happening to the statue. Try and think who this statue is of. It's a man we've studied in great detail so far. And then have a guess at where this is in Eastern Europe. If you've been paying attention, hopefully you already know. We'll make this even easier for you. This is a photo of the same statue a few days later with a traffic sign sticking out of it. This is, of course, Joseph Stalin. He had statues and paintings and memorials all the way around Eastern Europe as part of his cult of personality. In other words, he was trying to show himself to be this amazing, beautiful, incredible leader. After his death in 1953, most of these statues and memorials remained, but in 1956 the people of Hungary, during their Hungarian uprising, took down as many of these as possible. This lesson we're going to be looking at the Hungarian uprising in 1956, also called the Hungarian Crisis or the Hungarian Revolution. Now, the description challenge I'd like you all to be thinking about as we go through this and the next lesson. Did Stalin or Khrushchev do more to cause the uprising? Obviously, Stalin died in 1953, and the uprising is 3 years afterwards, so there might be a straightforward answer there. But as we go through the causes of the Hungarian uprising, you'll see that most of these causes are due to decisions that Stalin made either after World War II or in the years leading up to his death. So have a think about who did more to cause this attempted revolution. Looking at this map of Eastern Europe to give you an idea of where Hungary is, if you're not sure, you can see it's in a slightly odd location in Eastern Europe. It is just about bordering the Soviet Union, mainly bordering Czechoslovakia and Romania. To the south, we've got that odd exception of a communist country, Yugoslavia, who is not aligned with the USSR. In other words, they refuse to follow the USSR's instructions if they don't want to follow them. And then to the west, you've got Austria, a capitalist and democratic country. But you might remember in 1955, the Austrian State Treaty said that Austria would remain neutral in the Cold War. So it's not a place like Italy or France or even West Germany, where strictly speaking, they have a side. So we have an uprising in Eastern Europe. It's the first attempted rebellion against the communist government or against the USSR in general. There were rumblings in Poland in the same year, but it wasn't on the same level. We need to have a look at why there was an uprising in Hungary in 1956. Now, I've linked a BBC documentary clip. It's around 20 minutes long. I strongly recommend you see all of it. It's really, really good for trying dramatising the events and with loads of precise factual detail, which I'm sure you'll love to write down. You'll have to ignore the cut-glass English accents of these apparent Hungarian brother and sister. But if you push past that, the whole documentary is really good. I've also linked the textbook pages that you need for this, and the next few slides will cover the bare bones if you don't particularly want to go through the documentary or the textbook. In any case, on your notes, you should have 4 clear headings. It's the easiest way to make sure that you can understand the causes. You've got the leader of Hungary before the uprising, a man called Rákosi. You've got the Comecon, which we've learned about before, living standards in general, and Khrushchev's de-Stalinisation speech. So pause the video if you want and watch the clip. You can watch it all in one go, or you can go up to 12 minutes 30, listen to what I've got to say about the causes, and then watch the rest where you look at the events. Let's have a look at the causes in a bit more detail then. So you've got poor living standards in all of Hungary, but in particular in its capital city, Budapest. This is partly due to the Comecon. You might remember that Marshall Aid from 1948 onwards had been an attempt from America to rebuild Europe after World War II. But Stalin saw this quite rightly as a bribe from America to try and stop those countries from turning communist. So Hungary in particular had wanted to receive this aid, but they were blocked by Stalin. On top of that, because of the Comecon, there are constant food shortages. Now, Hungary is a country with a rich agricultural history. In other words, they've always been pretty self-sufficient. They've never really needed to import or buy in a lot of food. But under the Comecon, they're instructed to produce loads of food, and then that was taken away from them and redistributed amongst other Eastern European countries. So a country which produces loads of food actually had loads of food shortages. Even worse than that, loads of factories were created which were incredibly dangerous, produced shoddy goods, and didn't even pay particularly well. So living standards as a whole decreased, in part because of the Comecon. Outside of money, living standards aren't particularly good either. The religion of Hungary is strongly Catholic, and it has been for hundreds of years. But a communist, a true communist, doesn't believe in religion. So it follows that any communist country should suppress or reduce religious freedoms. The best example of that in Hungary is the leader of the Hungarian Catholic Church, a man by the name of Cardinal Mindszenty, cardinal being basically a smaller version of a pope or a larger version of an archbishop. Mindszenty was tortured and imprisoned for life in 1949 by the communists, and this was after he'd been tortured and imprisoned for life by the Nazis during World War II. So he was a clear emblem, he was a clear symbol of the religious freedoms of Hungarians being repressed. And on top of that, patriotism was repressed as well. Again, a true communist doesn't believe in nationality. They see the entire world as one brotherhood. So it follows then that in a truly communist country, you reduce or at least shrink down the patriotism of that country, unless you're in the Soviet Union. It's more than fine for the Soviet Union to be patriotic in this period, because after all, they were the first communist country. So a little bit of hypocrisy there to anger Hungarians even further. In terms of the other freedoms that are repressed due to communism, you might remember salami tactics from earlier periods. Salami tactics, the phrase itself, was coined by Rákosi, the communist leader of Hungary, from World War II up until this period. His use of secret police, in Hungary's case, it was known as the AVA or the AVH. They used informers and intimidation to silence any opposition. So it's another example of communism restricting freedom and just prompting constant anger. The final thing which really triggered the Hungarian uprising is Khrushchev's de-Stalinisation speech, which we looked at last lesson. Remember, this was supposed to only be heard by high-ranking communist officials, and then small events or small things would follow. But because it leaked out, many Hungarians heard this and thought Khrushchev is a brand new type of leader. He will allow us to get more freedoms. So they thought that they could uprise against the Hungarian government without the Soviet Union intervening, a calculation which was sadly very much mistaken. So, if you haven't already, watch the rest of the documentary on Hungarian crisis and make notes on what Nagy, the new leader of the Hungarian government, did and why and how the Soviet invasion played out. There's another stretch and challenge for you to be thinking about. Why do you think the West, or the USA in particular, would respond in a certain way? You might want to think back to the Berlin blockade and think, why would they not do a similar thing here? So we'll learn about the Western response in next lesson, but it is pathetically small. Basically amounts to Eisenhower, the president, shaking his fist and saying, "We disapprove." But try and think why the USA would be far less willing to intervene in Hungary than they would be in West Berlin or maybe West Germany. So we'll have a look at the events of the Hungarian uprising, and next lesson we'll go on to look at the consequences. So the uprising really starts with student demonstrations. And when we say students, we mean either university age or maybe college age, rather than some angry year 10 tearing down a statue. They started proceeding throughout Budapest, the capital city. These marches were supposed to be peaceful, but inevitably they ended up being disorganized and violent, with several students being shot by Soviet troops. This obviously made the situation even worse, and the next marches, the next demonstrations were even more people, even more unrest and disorder. This convinced Khrushchev that he needed to change the leadership of Hungary. So Rákosi was forced to step down, and they brought back a previous prime minister who served a very short time but had proven to be very popular with the people of Hungary. This was Imre Nagy. So in 1956 he becomes prime minister again. He convinced Khrushchev that they needed to carry out the sorts of reforms which Khrushchev had already carried out in the Soviet Union after de-Stalinisation. So this included freeing political prisoners like Cardinal Mindszenty. The problem is, Nagy was a communist, but he believed that people had to choose communism, whereas someone like Stalin or Lenin believed that there was no choice. People should not be allowed a choice. Khrushchev was somewhere in between these. So he did think that Stalin had gone too far, but he believed to his core that communism must always be followed. That meant that Nagy's proposed reforms like free press, free speech, and kind of democratic elections are too far. I say kind of democratic. Nagy thinks that you have to choose the option of communism, but only in a set choice. So in other words, you could choose hardline communism or softline communism or socialism. You're not going to be able to vote for a fascistic party like the Nazi Party, for example. The final straw is when Nagy announced that Hungary would leave the Warsaw Pact. Remember, that had only been set up a year earlier in 1955, and no Eastern European country had had a choice in it. You have to join the Warsaw Pact, and if one of those countries is invaded, all other countries must help. Nagy didn't think that this would serve Hungary's interests, so when he decided that he was going to leave, or Hungary would leave, that was the final straw for the Soviet Union, but also for other communist countries which had hardline leaders like East Germany and Poland. So while there were scenes like this playing out in Hungary, the Soviet Union and places like East Germany were preparing to invade, to remove Nagy from power, to bring back order and a clear instruction to follow the Soviet Union. Within 3 days of Nagy's announcement that they would leave the Warsaw Pact countries invaded Hungary. They actually already had several thousand soldiers and tanks outside major cities like Budapest, but they were waiting on orders from Khrushchev. This was clearly a massive decision from Khrushchev, and he had to visit several different leaders in Eastern European countries to kind of test the waters for this. But with the backing of other hardline governments, he gave the all clear, and within a week, the uprising had been crushed. 20,000 Hungarians and 7,000 Eastern European or Soviet troops were killed, but this was no contest. You have the might of the Soviet Union and several other countries against just one. The much easier solution for many Hungarians was simply to flee. Many Hungarians who remained would be killed in reprisals, kind of revenge killings for taking part or maybe having your family member take part in this. So many Hungarians would simply never return for fear of reprisals. Nagy himself did not escape. He was promised safe passage into another country, perhaps into the West, in return for trying to end the uprising. However, he was captured, he was transported to Moscow and executed a couple of years later. Nagy would be replaced by a puppet leader called Kadar, who will always follow the Soviet Union's directives until 1988, when he himself was removed. So what had started as a experiment in a lesser form of communism, kind of socialism or maybe a little bit of democracy, was ruthlessly crushed by the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries. So that was the causes and the events of Hungarian uprising. Next lesson we'll look at the consequences of it.